こんにちは皆さん。私の名前は大輝です。私は1年半ぐらい日本語を勉強しています。私の目的は来年に日本語能力試験の N に果たしたいだと思います。だからこのビデオを作ってます。このビデオの特別な理由が2つあります。1点目は私にとって話するために勉強するためにいい機会だと思ってます。2点目は私のどのような日本語勉強し方を教えていきたいだと思います。だからこのビデオの理由は私の日本語勉強する経験を共有して、そして君たちの日本語の勉強する経験も共有してくださいね。だからお互いに一緒に勉強できますね。こんな感じ。So in this video, I'm going to talk about how I have accomplished my current level of proficiency in Japanese and how I am approaching my language learning progress in order to take the N2 exam next year. I'm going to give you a step-by-step guide how you can also devise your study plan in order to make the right amount of progress with your Japanese, even if you have a full-time job or even if you have a full-time undergraduate degree which you are pursuing, which I'm doing, for example. And besides that, I'm still getting my hours in order to learn the Japanese language and making my progress improve my skills and my understanding my spoken language in Japanese. So study plan. I try to get at least 1 to 2 hours each day of actively learning the language by using the approach of comprehensible input. And why comprehensible input is one of the best approaches to new language is basically that you in your initial stage focusing on excessive amounts of input in a contextual manner and acquiring your new knowledge also in a context in order to enable yourself at later stages when you're producing something. For example, when you're speaking, you can also use the newly acquired vocabulary in the context, in the right context, and you know how to use it, when to use it, and what sentence structure you want to use these words. So it's very important, especially in Japanese, when you have the kanjis. If you're learning the kanji solely, it's not that beneficial for you since you want to actually use these kanjis in a context and in the right context. Therefore, I think for me, the best approach which I have come across is a comprehensible input, since it vastly improves your language learning progress and accelerates your language learning progress. And basically how comprehensible input is devised is that you get at first stage excessive amount of inputs. So you're focusing on 3 categories: listening, reading, and watching. And afterwards, if you have accomplished a certain degree of proficiency, then you might also increase your level of output and actually producing something such as, for example, writing or speaking. But first, I'm still at the first stage where I'm still focusing on listening, reading, and writing. And I'm subdividing these 3 categories into active learning sessions and also passive learning sessions. So actively pursuing is basically reading. I'm reading in my active sessions, and what I'm doing passively is basically listening and watching. So basically active learning sessions, which I'm doing preferably in the morning hours, since it's way easier for you to concentrate and to have the ability to focus for longer periods of bouts. And that's when I'm doing my 1 to 2 hours of active learning sessions each day, or the majority of my days. And what I'm doing there is basically I'm reading graded stories. So that's very important. You need material that are at your appropriate level, so you understand the gist of the storyline, basically 70 to 80%. And the goal is here to read from the beginning till the end and getting the storyline and not every word. When you're doing so repeatedly, story after story, and you're getting these excessive amounts of input in your brain, then your brain gets familiar with the grammatical structures, with the writing system like hiragana, katakana, and kanji. And then it's way easier for you to make progress instead of when you would be focusing on every word which is written in the great story. That's why I'm reading this book, Graded Story, but mainly this book, Short Stories from Ollie Richards, since it is well devised, that you have here the short story, and then you have also, after the short small summary here, and also the new vocabulary that are being written in the book, in the short story, and then also to check your understanding of the storyline, as you have some questions which you can answer when you understand actually the storyline. And that's the goal of having excessive amount of input, comprehensible input, to get the storyline, not every word, and then doing that excessively, create a story after short story, and then your brain gets familiar with it, and you might get the progress you want in understanding incrementally more. What I'm also doing is basically reading manga, but manga is still sometimes kanjis occur that you are not familiar with. Even though there are furiganas written above kanjis which you don't know how to pronunciate them. However, I'm still focusing on graded stories. One technique which I'm also using is when I'm reading actively is basically in order to improve my pronunciation is to read out loud. That's also one of the techniques which I heavily recommend you also in order to enhance your pronunciation and train your facial muscles to get familiar with the phonology of Japanese writing system. And that's what I'm doing actively, and passive learning is basically then the rest of the day, and it's by focusing on excessive amounts of inputs, not understanding every word. And I think the gist or the main goal in being able to get exposed to excessive amounts of input, that you are immersing yourself into the language. When you're reading something or when you watch or listening something, that you want to search for topics that interest you. I listen, for example, to these podcasts. That's very beneficial for me, since he provides English subtitles and also Japanese subtitles, which is tremendous benefits, since you get the phonology of Japanese spoken words and also directly linked to the Japanese subtitles, so you know how the phonology of the Japanese words is, but also how it's written. That's very important for you, since when you, for example, reading something and you can remember, I have heard this word before, or I've read this word before, and I know the phonology, so you already being familiar with the phonology and also with the how this kanji, for example, is being written. You make progress very fast in this case. But also you provide English subtitles, since we are still beginners or at intermediate level, and we still don't understand every word which is being said in the podcast, and you want to get the storyline. So I would also recommend in initial stages that you are also putting some English subtitles so that you get the storyline and might not get disappointed that you don't understand anything. So I highly recommend you this podcast, but also other podcasts, and watching anime, for example, on Animelon is also one website where you can read the Japanese subtitles, and also Romaji. Romaji is basically pronunciation of the Japanese writing system, and also the Japanese subtitles. That's in form of watching, but also you can expose yourself to listening to Japanese. That's also in form of podcast when you are on your way or commute to university, for example, or listening to Japanese music. That's also one good opportunity to get exposed to Japanese language. And one of you might ask yourself, when I'm learning kanji, it's not my focus. When I'm actively learning Japanese, since it's not in a context manner. However, if I want to learn kanji, I'm using this website, JLPT Sensei. It's also very good since it provides all the kanjis of N5 to N1, and I'm currently at stage N3, so I still try to understand the kanjis of N3. And I think that's also one of the best materials out there to get familiar with the kanjis, and especially when you're pursuing to write the JLPT exam, as I'm doing next year, N2. So I try to not to memorize, but to understand first all of the kanjis, and then going back to my to the main focus of my language learning progress in reading actually short stories, and then try to get familiar with the kanjis that I've already known from the JLP Sensei website, and maybe they have occurred in the reading story, and therefore I already got familiar with the kanji and know maybe how they're being used and how the phonology of the kanjis are. Another technique which I'm also using is active recall. So basically, active recall is I highly recommend you to watch this video here, since he explains it very well. Basically, what active recall is that you are trying to remember something from scratch. So you don't look up things, but you try to remember it lately from your brain and try to write it down with your pen on paper in order to really having understood, in my case, the kanji. And how I'm doing is basically I scan through all the kanjis, for example, in N5, and then doing something randomly, just taking a walk for 10 minutes and then coming back to my desk and then try to write all of the kanjis. So the kanji, the hiragana, how the pronunciation, and then also the meaning, how they're being used, in which context they're being used. And that's what I'm doing from scratch. It also enhances your remembrance of the kanji, of the actual kanji, how they're being written, how they're being pronunciated, and in which context they're being used. That's also a good task or method to utilize when pursuing actively learning the kanjis. And that's basically how I learned all the kanjis from N5 to N3. However, when I got familiar with the majority of the kanjis, then I'm still focusing on reading in order to foster the already known kanjis and putting them into context. Since you want to use the kanjis in context in the future when you're speaking, for example, or writing, so you already know which kanjis where to use in which context. So that's very important that you are not only get familiar with them, but also know how to use them and when to use them in which context. And that's when reading comes into play, that the kanjis occur in a context. Or for example, if you read mangas, then also the kanjis occur in the context. That's why I'm using Comprehensible Input, since it's way easier for me to remember the kanjis in a context, and also then at later stages produce and speak and write the kanjis in the proper context. So last but not least, what I want you to take you from this video is that you know why Comprehensible Input is so important, and that reading is one of the best methods to use in order to engage in language learning, in order to improve your understanding, your actual understanding of the language, and then being able to use a new vocabulary that you have acquired before in the right and proper context. So reading is basically your superpower, and it's also basically a cheat code to improve very fast. I think one of the best advices I've heard of, which I can give you, is basically to have fun, to incorporate fun into your language learning process, since it's way easier for you to actually delve into the language when you immerse yourself and when you have fun with it. So that's why I'm a heavily proponent of incorporating the actual stuff that interests you, that is tailored to your needs, to your interest, in order to be able to consistent over time. And actually then one day comes and then you get the gist of, I understand the language, I actually understand what he's talking about. Actually being able to go into a cinema without reading subtitles and understanding the storyline, just from always listening to Japanese, having been exposed to Japanese the majority of your days. That's a way to go, I think, and that's one of the best approaches I would give myself if I can repeat my language learning progress. And I think what is very important as well is that you have the mindset of a lifelong learner, that you're always being curious of how I am using Japanese in my daily life, and I'm having fun with it, and I want to immerse myself into the Japanese language. And I think that's also one of the keys to being able to actually understand the language at a high proficiency level. Being consistent every day and not forcing yourself, but having fun with it, and establishing maybe also the right habits, that you don't have to deliberately think, I need to delve into a reading session, but you're just doing it solely because of the pleasure that you're taking from it. So it's very important to have this mindset in order to improve your proficiency level to a degree where you can think to yourself that you're confident in speaking about topics that you understand properly. With that being said, thank you for watching. If you have any recommendations which I can also use in my language learning progress, and which I can take advantage of for my JLPT N2 exam next year, then please write a comment. With that being said, thank you for watching, and see you next time.